Peter Marshall, a wealthy and arrogant businessman, thrives on winning until a reckless bet challenges him to marry the fiercely independent Ella Kingston. What begins as a game of egos quickly transforms into an emotional journey, forcing both to confront their values, vulnerabilities, and the unexpected possibility of true love. The skyline of New York City glittered like 1,000 jewels scattered carelessly over velvet, but none shone brighter than the penthouse of Peter Marshall. Inside, the scene was a living portrait of excess. Crystal glasses clinked, laughter echoed, and a haze of champagne-fueled revelry danced in the air. Peter, the host of this opulent gathering, was unmistakable, the tall, impeccably dressed man at the center of every conversation, exuding an air of effortless arrogance. Peter Marshall wasn't just rich, he was obscenely rich. Heir to the Marshall Enterprises empire, he had built his own fortune atop his family's legacy. Cars, yachts, sprawling properties, everything about him screamed wealth and power. Yet it wasn't just his money that made people gravitate toward him. Peter was sharp, charismatic, and competitive to the core. Winning wasn't just a habit for him, it was his identity. "Peter, you've got to give someone else a chance to win once in a while," Jack Hudson teased, leaning casually against the bar. Jack, a longtime friend and occasional rival, had known Peter since their boarding school days. Where Peter was sharp and domineering, Jack was playful and a bit of a provocateur. And tonight he was in the mood to stir things up. "Win?" Peter smirked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "When you're me, Jack, there's no competition, just inevitability." Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "See, that's exactly what I mean, that arrogance of yours. One day, it's going to get you in trouble." The conversation caught the attention of the group surrounding them. A few leaned in, sensing the makings of a challenge. Peter lived for these moments, the spotlight, the stakes, the thrill of proving everyone wrong. Jack raised an eyebrow, his grin widening. "All right, hotshot. How about we test that unbeatable streak of yours?" Peter's smirk deepened. "Name the game." Jack paused for dramatic effect, then said, "Let's see if you can pull off the impossible. You've charmed your way through every woman in this city, but I bet there's one you can't win over." The group erupted in a mix of laughter and gasps. Peter leaned forward, intrigued. "Go on." Jack's eyes twinkled mischievously. "Ella Kingston." The name hung in the air like a dare. A few people exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Peter frowned slightly. He didn't recognize the name, and that alone irritated him. "Who?" he asked, his tone clipped. "Ella Kingston," Jack repeated, clearly enjoying Peter's reaction. Let's just say she's not your usual type, independent, sharp as a knife, and completely uninterested in men like you." Peter laughed, the sound rich and dismissive. "Uninterested? Please. Everyone has a price." Jack's grin widened. "That's exactly why this is going to be fun. I bet you 6 months, that you can't get Ella Kingston to fall for you. And I don't mean your usual tricks, no shallow flings, no business deals disguised as dates. I mean a real connection." Peter's competitive nature flared like a flame doused in gasoline. 6 months? Easy. What's in it for me when I win?" Jack shrugged. "Name it." "But when you lose, which you will, you admit, publicly, that you're not as irresistible as you think." The room collectively held its breath. Peter didn't lose, and the idea of him publicly conceding anything was unthinkable. Peter's jaw tightened, the challenge gleaming in his eyes. "Deal. But don't get too comfortable, Jack. You'll be the one eating your words." Jack raised his glass, toasting the wager. "We'll see. Good luck, Peter. You're going to need it." As the crowd dispersed, Peter found himself alone by the window, staring out over the city. He wasn't worried. He'd won tougher bets before. But something about this one lingered, a spark of intrigue. Who was Ella Kingston, and why did Jack think she was untouchable? Little did Peter know this wasn't going to be just another game. And Ella Kingston, she was about to change his world in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. Peter Marshall wasn't the type to leave things to chance, especially when it came to winning a bet. The morning after the party, he was already seated in his office, an expansive space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, skimming through the information Jack had casually provided about Ella Kingston. Her profile was unexpected. Ella Kingston wasn't part of New York's social elite. No extravagant gala appearances, no red carpet photos, no links to the usual circles Peter thrived in. Instead, she was an artist, an independent illustrator who ran her own boutique studio in Brooklyn, self-made, fiercely private, and, based on what Peter was reading, completely uninterested in luxury or superficial charm. Her work had been featured in a few notable publications, and her name carried weight in creative circles, but Ella didn't crave the spotlight. She was the opposite of the women Peter usually pursued, pragmatic, self-reliant, and, apparently, immune to the allure of wealth. Immune to wealth? Peter murmured to himself, leaning back in his chair. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. He'd heard that line before, and it always ended the same way, with him proving otherwise. But something about Ella intrigued him. Maybe it was the mystery, or perhaps it was Jack's smug confidence that Peter couldn't win her over. Whatever it was, he was looking forward to their first meeting. Peter didn't wait long to arrange it. He had his assistant set up a casual meeting at a cafe Ella was known to frequent, a spot in Brooklyn that had a reputation for being hip and understated. It wasn't his usual scene, but Peter was nothing if not adaptable. When he walked in, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the hum of low conversation greeted him. The space was cozy, filled with mismatched furniture and walls adorned with local artwork. Peter felt slightly out of place in his tailored suit, but he dismissed the thought. He was here for one reason, and he never failed to deliver. Then he saw her. Ella Kingston was sitting near the window, a sketchbook open in front of her, and a coffee mug balanced precariously on the edge of the table. She was nothing like the polished, glamorous women he was used to. Her auburn hair was loosely tied back, a few stray strands falling over her face as she focused on her drawing. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, yet she carried herself with an air of effortless confidence. For the first time in a long time, Peter hesitated, but only for a moment. Flashing his signature smile, he approached the table. "Ella Kingston, I presume?" She looked up, her expression unreadable as she studied him. Her hazel eyes were sharp, assessing him with a quiet intensity that caught him off guard. "Depends," she said after a beat. "Who's asking?" Peter chuckled softly, sliding into the chair across from her without waiting for an invitation. "Peter Marshall. I believe we have some mutual interests." Ella arched an eyebrow, leaning back in her seat. "Do we? Because I don't remember scheduling this meeting." Peter was used to women fawning over him or, at the very least, being charmed by his presence. But Ella's tone was neutral, her gaze steady, and her posture relaxed. It was as though she couldn't care less who he was or what he represented. He leaned forward slightly, his smile unwavering. "I've heard about your work. It's impressive. I thought it'd be worth discussing a potential collaboration." Ella tilted her head, her lips curling into a faint smirk. "You came all the way here to talk about my work?" You don't seem like the type who spends much time in Brooklyn, Mr. Marshall. Call me Peter, he said smoothly, and I go where opportunity takes me. Opportunity? She repeated, her tone laced with mild amusement. Right. The way she said it made him feel like she saw right through him. For the first time, Peter felt like he was playing a game he didn't fully understand. I like to get to know people I'm interested in working with, he added, his tone more measured now. Ella's smirk widened slightly. Good to know, but here's the thing, Peter, I'm not interested in opportunities that come with strings attached. So if this is one of those deals where I'm supposed to fawn over your money and connections, you've got the wrong girl. Peter blinked, stunned by her bluntness. Most people treaded carefully around him, their words calculated and their actions deferential. Ella, on the other hand, didn't seem remotely intimidated. If anything, she looked amused. He recovered quickly, his smile never faltering. I think you'll find I'm full of surprises, Ella. She laughed softly, shaking her head. I'm sure you are. But I've got work to finish, so if you'll excuse me. She closed her sketchbook, her tone polite but firm, a clear dismissal. Peter stood, recognizing that pressing further now would only make him seem desperate. But as he left the cafe, something unexpected happened. He smiled, not his usual calculated smirk, but a genuine smile. For the first time in years, Peter Marshall felt challenged, and he liked it. The next time Peter saw Ella, the setting was less casual and decidedly more intentional. This time, he didn't leave it up to chance. Instead of trying to run into her at a cafe or subtly charm her, he decided to lay his cards on the table. After all, Peter Marshall didn't lose, and he wasn't about to let Ella Kingston be the exception. He arranged for a meeting at a quaint little art gallery in Brooklyn, where one of Ella's illustrations was featured as part of a local showcase. Peter, ever the strategist, made sure to attend the opening night. When Ella spotted him lingering near her piece, a stunning, minimalist work of abstract lines that somehow felt both chaotic and calm, her brows furrowed. I didn't take you for the art gallery type, she said, approaching him. Her tone was wary but curious, as though she were trying to figure out what game he was playing. Peter turned to her with his signature smile, hands casually tucked into the pockets of his tailored jacket. I've been known to appreciate good art, and this, he gestured toward her piece, is very good. She crossed her arms, studying him. You've been keeping tabs on me. Let's call it research, Peter replied smoothly. I like to understand the people I admire. Admire? She raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. What do you want, Peter? There it was. Direct, no nonsense, and completely devoid of the pretenses he was so used to. Peter respected it, even if it threw him off his game. I want to make you a proposition, he said, his tone light but calculated. Hear me out before you say no. Ella sighed, glancing around the room as though looking for an escape. When none presented itself, she folded her arms and nodded. You've got 2 minutes. Peter grinned. How generous of you. He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to keep their conversation private. You've caught my attention, Ella, and I think we both know I've caught yours. Debatable, she muttered, but he noticed the faint flicker of a smile she tried to suppress. I'm offering you an arrangement, Peter continued. A partnership, if you will. 6 months. We spend time together, get to know each other. No strings, no expectations. Just see where it goes. Ella tilted her head, studying him like he was some kind of abstract puzzle she was trying to solve. And why exactly would I agree to this arrangement? Because you're curious about me, Peter replied confidently. And because I think you'd enjoy proving me wrong. She laughed, a soft, genuine sound that caught him off guard. "You're remarkably self-assured, Peter. I'll give you that." "It's not self-assurance," he said, his grin widening. "It's knowing when I've found something, or someone, worth pursuing." Ella was silent for a moment, her gaze sharp and searching. Peter could see the gears turning in her mind, and he resisted the urge to say anything more. Finally, she spoke. "Fine," she said, her tone clipped but deliberate. "I'll agree to your proposal, but on my terms." Peter's smile faltered slightly. "Terms?" "Yes, terms," she said, her eyes narrowing. "First, I don't care about your money, your connections, or whatever empire you're running. Keep all that out of this." "Done," Peter said quickly. It wasn't the concession she thought it was. He planned to show her his world regardless. "Second," Ella continued, "I don't owe you anything. If at any point I feel like walking away, I will. No explanations." Peter hesitated but nodded. "Fair. And third," she stepped closer, her voice lowering, "if I find out you're hiding anything at all, this ends immediately. No second chances." For a moment, Peter felt a flicker of discomfort, but he quickly buried it under his usual charm. "Agreed. Ella extendio su mano. Then we have a deal." Peter took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "We have a deal." As she pulled away, something about the way she looked at him made him pause. There was something guarded in her expression, something almost calculating. He couldn't quite place it, but it sent a ripple of unease through him. Ella Kingston wasn't like anyone he'd ever met. And though he still viewed this as a game, a challenge he was determined to win, there was something about her that was beginning to feel different. As Peter left the gallery that evening, a nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind. Ella had agreed to his proposal, but not without those firm conditions. And for a brief moment, he wondered, was she playing a game of her own? In the quiet of the gallery, Ella watched him leave, her expression unreadable. Her lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. This arrangement wasn't about Peter Marshall, not entirely at least. She had her own reasons for saying yes, reasons she had no intention of sharing. Not yet. 2 weeks after their deal, Peter found himself in unfamiliar territory. He was a man of action, used to making decisions with ruthless efficiency. But when it came to Ella Kingston, everything seemed to take a little more effort and a lot more patience. The first hurdle, the wedding preparations. Ella, unsurprisingly, wasn't the type to indulge in the pomp and grandeur Peter was accustomed to. When his assistant emailed her a list of luxury venues, complete with sprawling estates and glittering ballrooms, her response was curt and uncompromising. "How about we skip the part where you try to impress me with an overpriced wedding and just keep it simple," Ella had said, sipping her coffee as though they were discussing something as mundane as grocery shopping. Peter blinked, his mind struggling to process her words. "Simple?" "Yes, simple. Small ceremony, close friends, no need for all the theatrics." Theatrics. Peter almost laughed at the irony. For someone who spent his life surrounded by theatrics, elaborate parties, lavish gifts, grand gestures, Ella's casual dismissal of it all was both infuriating and, he had to admit, intriguing. "You do realize who you're marrying, right?" he asked, his tone laced with amusement. "Oh, I'm well aware," Ella replied with a sly smile. "But this isn't about you, Peter. It's about us. And frankly, I'm not interested in playing the part of the blushing bride at a spectacle for your business partners." For the first time in years, Peter was at a loss for words. He prided himself on his ability to win people over, to sway them to his way of thinking. But Ella wasn't swayed. If anything, she seemed to enjoy challenging him. As the weeks went on, the clash between their worlds became increasingly apparent. Peter lived in a penthouse that was more like a palace in the sky, floor-to-ceiling windows, state-of-the-art technology, and decor that screamed wealth and excess. Ella, on the other hand, rented a modest apartment in Brooklyn filled with mismatched furniture, colorful rugs, and stacks of art supplies scattered across every surface. Her space was warm and lived in, a stark contrast to the cold, polished perfection of his home. When Peter invited her over to discuss final wedding details, the tension was palpable from the moment she stepped inside. "The place is intimidating," Ella admitted, glancing around the gleaming penthouse. "Do you actually live here, or is it just a showroom?" Peter chuckled, pouring her a glass of wine. "Funny, I was going to ask if your apartment came with a scavenger hunt." She rolled her eyes, but took the glass, settling onto the leather sofa. "Seriously though, Peter, this isn't me, and I'm not going to pretend it is just because we're doing this thing." "Thing?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You mean our marriage?" "Call it what you want," she said with a shrug. "But I'm not going to change who I am for it. So don't expect me to fit into your world like some accessory." Peter leaned back, studying her. She wasn't angry. Her tone was calm, almost matter-of-fact, but her words carried weight. It wasn't a challenge or a plea. It was a boundary, and he respected it, even if it irritated him. The wedding preparations continued, each step revealing more of their differences. Peter insisted on hiring a top-tier event planner, while Ella opted for DIY decorations and a small venue in the heart of Brooklyn. "Peter, do you even know what handmade wedding invitations look like?" Ella teased one afternoon as they argued over stationery options. "No," he admitted with a smirk, "and I'm pretty sure I don't want to." "You're impossible," she said, shaking her head. "And you're stubborn," he shot back, but there was no malice in his words. Despite their bickering, there were moments of unexpected understanding, like the time Peter found himself at a thrift store with Ella, helping her pick out vintage centerpieces for the reception. He couldn't remember the last time he'd set foot in a place that didn't have designer labels on everything, but somehow watching Ella light up over mismatched candlesticks made it worth it. "You're actually enjoying this, aren't you?" she asked, catching him smiling. "Don't get used to it," he replied, but the softness in his voice betrayed him. But for every moment of harmony, there was an equal moment of tension. One evening, as they went over guest lists, Ella brought up an uncomfortable truth. "You know, this whole thing still feels like a game to you," she said, her tone quiet but firm. Peter looked up from his tablet, surprised. "What makes you say that?" "Because you're still trying to win," she said, meeting his gaze. "Even now you're not treating this like it's real. You're treating it like a bet." The words struck a nerve, but Peter quickly masked it with a chuckle. "Ella, you agreed to this arrangement. What did you think it was going to be?" "I thought it was going to be two people figuring out how to meet halfway," she said softly. "But right now it feels like you're just waiting to prove something. To me, to yourself, to whoever." Peter didn't respond right away. For the first time, he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, and it unsettled him. "You're not wrong," he admitted finally, his voice quieter than usual. "But maybe you're not giving me enough credit either." Ella didn't reply, and the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tension. As the wedding date approached, both of them found themselves testing each other's limits, pushing boundaries, and grappling with the reality of their differences. What neither of them realized yet was that these clashes weren't pulling them apart. They were slowly, quietly drawing them closer together. The wedding day arrived as if it were nothing more than a line item on Peter Marshall's calendar. There were no sweeping gestures of romance, no heartfelt vows exchanged under a sunset. Instead, there was efficiency, precision, cold professionalism disguised as ceremony. The venue, a small, modern event space Ella had chosen, was understated and elegant, with simple floral arrangements and a minimalist aesthetic. Ella had insisted on a short guest list, limiting it to a handful of her close friends and family, while Peter's side was populated by a select group of business associates, including Jack, the instigator of the bet. Peter arrived on time, dressed impeccably in a custom-tailored tuxedo. He exuded confidence, his easy smile making it seem like he owned the entire room. But beneath the surface, there was a restless energy, a sense that this was just another deal to close. Ella, on the other hand, entered the ceremony with quiet composure. Her dress was simple, yet stunning, an off-white satin gown that skimmed her figure gracefully, paired with minimal jewelry and a bouquet of wildflowers she had insisted on arranging herself. There was no nervousness in her demeanor, only a calm resolve that caught Peter slightly off guard. As she walked down the aisle, Peter couldn't help but feel a flicker of something unexpected. Admiration, perhaps. Or maybe it was just the way she carried herself, with a confidence that made it clear she was here on her own terms. The ceremony itself was quick and impersonal, much like a business transaction. The officiant spoke the required words, asking them to exchange vows. Peter, ever the charmer, delivered his with practiced ease, his voice steady and confident. "Ella, I promise to stand by your side, to respect your independence, and to—" He paused, smirking slightly. "Do my best to keep up with you." It earned a faint chuckle from the small crowd, but Ella's expression remained neutral. When it was her turn, Ella kept her vow short and practical. "Peter, I promise to hold up my end of this agreement, to be honest with you, and to remind you that not everything in life is a competition." Peter raised an eyebrow at her choice of words, but he said nothing. The rings were exchanged with the same efficiency, and when the officiant finally declared them husband and wife, there was polite applause. Peter leaned in to kiss her, and while it was technically their first kiss as a married couple, it lacked the spark or passion one might expect. It was brief, almost obligatory, a mere punctuation mark on the end of a deal. Afterward, they skipped the reception. Ella had insisted on it, arguing that there was no need for unnecessary pomp and circumstance. Peter had agreed, though not without a hint of disappointment. He thrived in social settings, and a reception would have been the perfect opportunity to bask in the attention. Instead, the newlyweds left the venue and headed straight for Peter's penthouse. The penthouse, perched atop a gleaming Manhattan skyscraper, was every bit as opulent as one would expect. When they arrived, Peter led Ella inside, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. "Welcome home," he said, his tone laced with a mix of pride and charm. Ella stepped inside, her eyes scanning the expansive space. The open-concept living area was flooded with natural light, thanks to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Everything was pristine, from the marble floors to the sleek, modern furniture. "It's impressive," she said finally, though her tone was more reserved than complimentary. Peter smirked, closing the door behind them. "You could sound a little more excited, you know." Ella turned to him, her expression unreadable. "It's just a lot. This isn't exactly what I'm used to." "You'll get used to it," he said, confidently, moving toward the bar to pour himself a drink. "Trust me, this place has everything you could ever want." "That's the thing, Peter," she replied, her voice steady. "I don't want all of this. I never did." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment Peter felt a flicker of frustration. He was trying, wasn't he? He had given her access to his world, opened his home to her. Shouldn't that count for something? But Ella wasn't one to be impressed by material things. Instead of marveling at the penthouse, she walked over to the windows, her gaze fixed on the city below. "It's beautiful," she said softly, more to herself than to him. Peter joined her, holding a glass of whiskey. "It's the best view in the city. It's also lonely," she added, her reflection in the glass meeting his eyes. He didn't respond right away, caught off guard by the honesty in her words. That night, as they settled into their new arrangement, the tension between them lingered. Ella unpacked her belongings, what little she had brought, with quiet efficiency, placing her books and art supplies in the guest room she had claimed as her studio. Peter watched her from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to stay in there," he said finally. "I know," she replied without looking up. The unspoken distance between them was palpable. For Peter, the marriage felt like a victory, another challenge conquered. But for Ella, it was something else entirely. She wasn't playing his game, not really. She was here for her own reasons, reasons she kept locked away behind that guarded strength he couldn't quite break through. As Peter retreated to the master bedroom, he couldn't shake the feeling that Ella was a puzzle he hadn't solved yet. And for the first time in a long time, he wondered if winning wasn't going to be as straightforward as he had thought. The first week of married life started like an awkward roommate situation. Two people navigating a shared space while silently wondering if they'd made a colossal mistake. Peter, for all his confidence, had assumed Ella would be easy to figure out. After all, most people in his life responded predictably to money, charm and power. But Ella, she was an entirely different equation. Their mornings became an exercise in adjustment. Peter, used to rising late and having breakfast served by his chef, now found himself waking up to the sound of Ella's alarm blaring at 6 a.m. "You're up early," he remarked one morning, watching her pour herself a cup of coffee in the kitchen. She was dressed in yoga pants and a loose sweatshirt, her hair tied up in a messy bun. "Some of us have jobs to get to," she replied with a teasing smirk. Peter raised an eyebrow. "You do realize you don't have to work anymore, right? I can cover whatever you need." Ella snorted, taking a sip of her coffee. "That's cute, but I'm not giving up my job just because you think I should. I'm just saying you don't have to—" "Peter," she interrupted, setting her mug down with a soft thud. "I've been taking care of myself for a long time. I'm not about to stop now. Besides, I like my job." Her independence unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. He wasn't used to people rejecting his offers of help, or, more accurately, his offers of control. By midday, their contrasting lifestyles clashed again. Peter had arranged for a luxury boutique to send a personal shopper to the penthouse, hoping to surprise Ella with an upgraded wardrobe. He envisioned her in sleek designer outfits, perfectly tailored to match his polished world. But when the stylist arrived, Ella's reaction wasn't what he expected. "Is this a joke?" she asked, staring at the racks of clothes that had taken over the living room. "What?" "No," Peter said, genuinely confused. "I thought you'd like it." Ella plegó sus brazos, su expresión partes iguales entre divertida y molesta. "I don't need a bunch of overpriced clothes to feel good about myself. Thanks, though." "You're really not even going to try anything on?" he asked, his tone tinged with disbelief. "Nope," she said, walking past him to grab her bag. "But hey, if you need help returning it all, let me know." Peter stared after her, momentarily stunned. No one turned down gifts from Peter Marshall, at least no one ever had before. Then there were the evenings, where the differences in their routines played out like a sitcom. Peter liked to unwind with a glass of whiskey and a movie in his state-of-the-art home theatre. Ella, on the other hand, preferred to curl up in the guest room with her sketchpad and a playlist of indie music he found grating. One night, Peter tried to bridge the gap. "Come on," he said, standing in the doorway of her makeshift studio. "You've got to see this new sound system. It'll blow your mind." "I'm good here," Ella replied without looking up from her sketchpad. "Seriously? You'd rather sit here drawing—" "What is that? A tree?" "It's a dragon," she corrected, holding up the paper with a grin. "And yes, I'd rather be here." Peter sighed dramatically but didn't push further. He wasn't used to people saying no to him, and Ella seemed to be making a sport out of it. Despite the friction, there were moments of unexpected humor. One morning, Peter attempted to make coffee after Ella had left for work. He pressed the wrong button on her fancy French press and ended up flooding the counter with hot water. When she came home that evening, she found him glaring at the offending appliance like it had personally insulted him. "Rough day?" she teased, stifling a laugh. "This thing is defective," he grumbled. "Or maybe you're just not as perfect as you think," she shot back with a wink. Later that week, Ella returned the favor by accidentally knocking over one of Peter's prized art sculptures, a sleek, abstract piece he'd paid a fortune for. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she said, crouching to inspect the damage. Peter walked in, saw the shattered base, and raised an eyebrow. "Well, there goes 20 grand. Ella cringed. "I can pay you back." "Relax," he said, smirking. "It wasn't my favorite anyway." They both burst into laughter, the tension between them momentarily melting away. But as the days turned into weeks, Peter's frustration grew. He wasn't used to losing control, and Ella's refusal to conform to his expectations was both maddening and fascinating. She didn't need him in the way he expected. She didn't crave his approval or rely on his wealth to define her. One evening, after another failed attempt to impress her with an extravagant gesture, Peter confronted her in the living room. "Why are you so determined to keep me at arm's length?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Ella looked up from her book, her brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" "You're always pushing back. Every time I try to do something nice for you, you act like I'm the bad guy." She closed the book, setting it aside. "Peter, it's not about you being the bad guy. It's about you thinking you can fix everything with money or gestures. That's not how I work." "Then how do you work?" he shot back, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Ella suspirò, su mirada fermi. "I don't need you to impress me, Peter. I need you to see me. That's the difference." Her words hit him harder than he expected, leaving him standing there, unsure of how to respond. As she walked past him to her room, he realized something unsettling. For the first time in years, Peter Marshall didn't know how to win. For Peter Marshall, life had always been a series of victories, deals closed, challenges conquered, egos subdued. Yet, for all his successes, his new wife, Ella Kingston, remained an enigma he couldn't quite unravel. The longer they lived together, the more Peter found himself noticing the little things about her. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was deep in thought. The faint crease that appeared between her eyebrows when she concentrated. How her laugh, rare as it was, had a way of softening the hardest edges of his day. He hadn't expected to feel this way, hadn't planned on being drawn to her in ways that had nothing to do with the bet. And that terrified him. It started with a quiet moment one evening. Ella was curled up on the couch, sketching something in her notebook, while Peter sat at the opposite end, absently scrolling through his phone. The soft strains of her favorite indie playlist filled the silence. "What are you working on?" he asked, breaking the quiet. Ella glanced up, hesitating for a moment before turning the notebook around to show him. It was a sketch of a woman standing at the edge of a cliff, her hair blowing in the wind. "It's beautiful," he said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. "Thanks," she replied softly, her gaze lingering on the drawing. "It's kind of personal." Peter raised an eyebrow, leaning in slightly. "Personal how?" Ella hesitated again, as if debating whether to let him in. Finally, she said, "It's a metaphor, I guess, for taking risks, for standing on the edge and not knowing if you're going to fall or fly." The vulnerability in her tone caught Peter off guard. For the first time, he realized there was more to Ella than her sharp wit and fierce independence. There was a depth to her, a quiet strength born from something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "Have you ever been on that edge?" he asked, his voice softer now. Ella looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his as if trying to decide how much to reveal. "More times than I'd like to admit," she said finally. Peter didn't press further, sensing that she wasn't ready to share more. But the moment lingered, charged with an unspoken understanding that neither of them fully acknowledged. As the days went on, Peter found himself making small changes without even realizing it. He started waking up earlier, joining Ella in the kitchen for coffee before she left for work. At first, it was awkward. He wasn't exactly a morning person, but he found he didn't mind as much when she was there. One morning, she caught him trying to make pancakes, the kitchen a chaotic mess of flour and batter. "What are you doing?" she asked, suppressing a laugh. "Trying to impress you," he admitted with a sheepish grin. Ella raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Well, points for effort, but maybe next time try reading the recipe first." Her teasing smile made the disaster worth it. For Ella, the change in Peter was unexpected. She'd pegged him as arrogant, self-centered, and incapable of real connection. But lately, he'd been different, softer somehow, less focused on winning and more focused on her. It scared her in a way she wasn't ready to admit. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, she came home to find Peter in the kitchen again. This time, he wasn't cooking. He was setting up takeout containers from her favorite Thai place. "Dinner's ready," he said with a grin, holding up a pair of chopsticks. Ella blinked, caught off guard. "How did you—" "Google," he said, cutting her off. "And maybe a little stalking of your Instagram. You posted about this place a few months ago." She laughed, despite herself, the sound light and genuine. "You stalked my Instagram?" "Don't act like you're not flattered," he teased, handing her a plate. As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed more easily than it ever had before. They talked about everything and nothing, her job, his latest business deal, the ridiculous TV show they'd both secretly started watching when they thought the other wasn't paying attention. For the first time, Ella let herself relax around him. And for the first time, Peter felt like he was getting a glimpse of the real Ella, the one who wasn't constantly guarding her walls. One night, the tension between them shifted again. They were watching a movie in the living room, the space dimly lit by the glow of the screen. Peter had stretched out on the couch, and Ella sat at the opposite end, her legs tucked beneath her. At some point, without either of them realizing it, the distance between them disappeared. Ella leaned back against the armrest, her head resting near Peter's shoulder. He hesitated for a moment before wrapping an arm around her, pulling her closer. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let out a soft sigh, her guard slipping just a little more. "You're not as bad as I thought you'd be," she murmured, her voice laced with teasing warmth. Peter chuckled, his breath brushing against her hair. "High praise, coming from you." For a moment, the world outside the penthouse didn't exist. It was just the two of them, caught in a rare moment of peace. But beneath the growing bond, there were still unspoken truths and unresolved tensions. Ella's walls hadn't completely come down, and Peter knew she was still holding something back. And then there was the bet. A dark cloud that loomed over everything, threatening to undo whatever fragile connection they were building. For now, though, neither of them said anything. They let themselves exist in the moment, knowing that the storm was coming, but choosing, for just a little while, to ignore it. The whispers started small, a sly comment here, a loaded question there. At first, Peter dismissed it as the usual gossip that surrounded someone like him. A billionaire playboy settling down was bound to make waves. But as the days turned into weeks, the scrutiny surrounding his sudden marriage to Ella Kingston began to take on a life of its own. Tabloids ran with salacious headlines: Peter Marshall's mysterious bride, gold digger, or true love. Billionaire bachelor tamed, is it real or a PR stunt? Social media wasn't much kinder. Speculation about Ella's motives flooded comment sections, painting her as an opportunist who had somehow tricked Peter into marriage. Ella tried to ignore it, but the constant hum of judgment was impossible to escape. At work, she overheard her co-workers whispering. In line at the coffee shop, she caught someone scrolling through an article with her name in bold print. "What did you expect?" she muttered to herself late one night, staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. "You married Peter Marshall. Of course, the world's watching." But knowing it didn't make it any easier. For Peter, the media frenzy wasn't new, but the way it targeted Ella struck a nerve. He hadn't anticipated how protective he would feel, or how much the headlines would irritate him. It all came to a head during a business luncheon where Peter found himself seated next to Victor Caldwell, an old rival with a penchant for stirring the pot. "So," Victor began, swirling his glass of wine, "I hear congratulations are in order. Married life, huh?" "Never thought I'd see the day," Peter forced a polite smile. "Things change, Victor." Sure, Victor said, his tone dripping with mock sincerity, though I have to admit I was surprised. "Ella Kingston, was it?" "Not exactly your usual type, no offense." Peter's jaw tightened. "None taken." Victor leaned in, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "You know, people are saying she's, what's the term? Social climbing. You might want to keep an eye on her." Peter's smile disappeared, replaced by a sharp edge in his tone. "Ella doesn't need to climb anything. She's doing just fine on her own." Victor raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. "Touchy subject, is it?" "Just stating facts," Peter replied coolly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have better things to do than entertain baseless gossip." He left the table without another word, his fists clenched as he walked away. The next day, Ella found herself in the eye of the storm once again, this time courtesy of a viral video. In the clip, Peter was caught on camera at the luncheon, defending her in no uncertain terms. His words were sharp, his tone unapologetic. "Ella doesn't need my money or my name," he said to a group of reporters. "Anyone who thinks otherwise clearly doesn't know her, or me." Ella stared at her phone, replaying the video. She didn't know what surprised her more, the fact that Peter had defended her so publicly, or the genuine anger in his voice. She wasn't the only one shocked. At work, her usually distant boss stopped by her desk. "Saw the video," he said, with a rare smile. "Seems like your husband's got your back." Her co-workers, who had been treating her with thinly veiled skepticism since the wedding, suddenly acted like her best friends. "You're so lucky," one of them gushed during lunch. "Peter Marshall is practically a real-life Prince Charming." Ella forced a smile, but her mind was racing. That evening, when Peter came home, Ella was waiting for him in the living room. "So," she began, crossing her arms, "you made quite the statement today." Peter glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I said what needed to be said." She raised an eyebrow. "And why did it need to be said?" "Because I'm not going to sit back and let people drag your name through the mud," he replied, his tone firm. "You don't deserve that." Ella's heart twisted at his words, but she didn't let it show. "It's not like you to care what people think," she said, her voice quieter now. Peter hesitated, his gaze softening. "I don't care what they think about me, but you? That's different." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Peter nodded, his usual arrogance replaced by something quieter, almost vulnerable. "I meant what I said, Ella. You're stronger than they'll ever give you credit for." But as much as Ella wanted to believe him, a small part of her couldn't shake the doubt. Was his defense of her genuine, or was it just another move in the game he was playing? She found herself torn between admiration for the man he was showing her and distrust for the man she feared he still might be. And Peter, for all his bravado, couldn't deny the nagging feeling that the lines between the bet and his real feelings were becoming dangerously blurred. For now, the storm outside their marriage had been temporarily quieted. But the storm within was only just beginning. The days following Peter's public defense of Ella brought a quiet shift between them. The tension that had defined their marriage began to soften, replaced by something neither of them had expected: understanding. It started with a simple question. "You've been quiet lately," Peter said one evening as they sat in the living room, a glass of wine in his hand. Ella glanced up from the book she was pretending to read. "I've just had a lot on my mind." "Like what?" She hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the book. Finally, she set it down and looked at him. "Why did you do it?" "Do what?" "Defend me in front of everyone." Peter leaned back, swirling the wine in his glass. "Because it was the truth. You don't deserve the things they're saying about you." Ella searched his face, trying to find any trace of insincerity. But there was none. "Thank you," she said softly. "It meant more than I thought it would." Peter smirked, though it lacked his usual arrogance. "Don't tell me you're starting to like me." Ella rolled her eyes, but there was a small smile on her lips. "Don't push it, Marshall." That night, as they sat on the couch, something shifted. The usual walls between them seemed thinner, more fragile. Peter was the first to crack. "You know," he began, staring into his glass, "I wasn't always this successful." Ella raised an eyebrow, surprised by the admission. "You? Not successful? I find that hard to believe." Peter let out a dry laugh. "Well, believe it. My first business venture was a complete disaster. I was in my early 20s, fresh out of college, convinced I was going to conquer the world. What happened? I sunk everything into a start-up. Money, time, energy. I even convinced my dad to invest in it. And then it failed, spectacularly. Ella tilted her head, curiosity softening her features. How did you bounce back? I didn't. Not at first, Peter admitted, his voice quieter now. I felt like a fraud, like I wasn't good enough. It wasn't until years later, when I started over from scratch, that I finally got it right. Ella watched him carefully, her own walls starting to crack. That must have been hard. It was, Peter said, meeting her gaze. But it taught me something. Failure isn't the end, it's just a step. For the first time, Ella saw a different side of Peter, one that wasn't defined by arrogance or charm, but by vulnerability. And in that moment, she decided to share a piece of herself too. You're not the only one who's failed, she said softly. Peter frowned, his interest piqued. What do you mean? Ella hesitated, her fingers tracing patterns on the armrest. When I was younger, I had this dream of being an artist. I wanted to paint, to create, but my family didn't think it was practical. They pushed me into accounting instead. And you listened to them? Ella si incogio di ombros. I thought they were right. I thought being an artist wasn't enough, so I gave it up. But sometimes I wonder, what if I'd fought harder for it? Peter studied her, his usual smirk replaced by something softer. Why don't you start now? Ella let out a dry laugh. It's not that simple. Why not? Peter pressed. You're talented. I've seen your sketches. Ella's cheeks flushed. Those aren't good enough. They're just scribbles. Says who? Peter challenged. Ella, you've spent your whole life listening to what other people think. Maybe it's time to listen to yourself. The conversation stayed with both of them long after it ended. For Ella, it was a reminder of the dreams she'd buried long ago, dreams she wasn't sure she was ready to face. For Peter, it was a revelation. Ella wasn't the gold-digging opportunist the tabloids made her out to be. She was someone who had been forced to make hard choices, someone who had sacrificed her own happiness for the sake of others. Over the next few weeks, the dynamic between them continued to shift. One evening, Peter surprised her by bringing home a set of painting supplies, canvases, brushes, paints. What's this? Ella preguntó, mirando la pila con suspicacia. Call it a nudge, Peter said with a grin. You can't keep making excuses if the tools are right here. Ella laughed despite herself. You're impossible. True, he admitted. But you're welcome. In turn, Ella started encouraging Peter in ways she hadn't before. During one of their late-night talks, he confided in her about a risky business deal he was considering. It's a gamble, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. If it works, it could be huge, but if it doesn't, you'll bounce back, Ella said firmly. Peter looked at her, surprised. You sound awfully confident. I am, she said with a small smile. You've done it before, haven't you? You'll figure it out. Her faith in him was unexpected, but it gave him the push he needed. With each shared struggle, the distance between them grew smaller. Their conversations grew deeper, their connection more genuine. For the first time, the marriage didn't feel like a transaction or a game. It felt real. And that terrified them both. Because beneath the growing bond lay a truth that had yet to be revealed, a truth that threatened to undo everything they had built. Ella had always been careful not to dig too deeply into the circumstances of her sudden, whirlwind marriage to Peter Marshall. She told herself it didn't matter. She had her reasons for agreeing, and Peter had his, whatever they were. But something had been nagging at her lately, a small, persistent voice, whispering that there was more to the story than she knew. The tipping point came during an otherwise unremarkable evening. Peter had stepped out for a business meeting, leaving Ella alone in the penthouse. She decided to tidy up the office, a space Peter usually kept meticulously organized. That's when she found it. A folder tucked into the back of a drawer. Inside were several documents, emails, handwritten notes, and, most damningly, a copy of the original bet written out on Jack's stationery. Her hands trembled as she read the words. 6 months. Make a fall for you. Prove it with marriage. Stakes, $500,000. The room seemed to spin around her. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The entire marriage, the dates, the moments, the gestures had started as a game. A cruel, arrogant game. When Peter came home that night, Ella was waiting for him in the living room, the folder sitting on the coffee table in front of her like a loaded gun. "Ella," he said, noticing her expression, "what's wrong?" "Why don't you tell me?" she replied, her voice icy. Peter's eyes flicked to the folder and his heart sank. "Where did you find that?" "It doesn't matter where I found it," she snapped, standing up. "What matters is what it says. A bet, Peter. Our marriage started because of a bet." "It's not what you think," Peter said quickly, stepping closer to her. Ella rió amargamente, sacudiendo la cabeza. "Oh, really?" "Because it looks pretty straightforward to me. You married me for a game, Peter. A game." "At first, yes," Peter admitted, his voice desperate. "But it's not like that anymore." Ella's eyes narrowed. "How am I supposed to believe that? Everything we've done, everything you've said. How do I know any of it was real?" "It is real," Peter insisted. "Ella, please, you have to believe me. I never expected to feel this way about you." "And how do you feel about me, Peter?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Do you even know? Or is this just another move in your game?" Peter reached for her, but she stepped back, tears streaming down her face. "Don't," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't get to touch me, not after this." "Ella, I can't do this," she interrupted, grabbing her coat. "I can't stay here, Peter, not with you." She stormed out of the penthouse, slamming the door behind her, leaving Peter standing there in stunned silence. The days that followed were some of the longest of Peter's life. Ella no respondió a sus llamadas ni respondió a sus mensajes. She stayed at a hotel across the city, isolating herself from everyone, including him. Peter couldn't stop replaying the fight in his head. He hated himself for the bet, for letting Jack manipulate him into something so callous. But more than that, he hated that he might have ruined the one thing that had come to mean something real in his life. Jack tried to reach out once, laughing it off as if it were no big deal. "She'll come around," he said. "Women always do." But Peter wasn't laughing. "Stay out of my life, Jack," he snapped before hanging up. For Ella, the pain was unbearable. She felt humiliated, betrayed, and foolish for ever letting herself believe Peter's gestures and words had been genuine. But at the same time, she couldn't shake the memories of the Peter she had come to know, the man who had encouraged her dreams, shared his vulnerabilities, and defended her when no one else had. Was it possible that he had changed, or was that just another illusion? A week later, Peter decided he couldn't wait any longer. He needed to see her to try to make things right. He found her in a small cafe, sipping coffee and staring out the window. She looked tired, her usual spark dulled by the weight of everything that had happened. "Ella," he said softly, sitting down across from her. She looked up, her expression guarded. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," he said, his voice earnest. To explain. Ella Cruzos's Brazos. You've had plenty of time to explain, Peter. Why now? Because I can't lose you, he admitted, the vulnerability in his tone catching her off guard. Yes, the marriage started as a bet. I was an idiot for agreeing to it. But somewhere along the way it stopped being about that. You changed everything, Ella. Ella stared at him, her emotions warring inside her. You expect me to just forget what you did, to trust you again after this? No, Peter said quietly. I don't expect anything, but I want you to know that I'm not that guy anymore. I don't care about the bet, the stakes, or any of it. I care about you, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove that. Ella's heart ached at his words, but the wounds were still fresh. I need time, Peter, she said finally. I can't just jump back into this. I'll wait, he promised, as long as it takes. For both of them, the road ahead was uncertain. The truth had shattered their fragile bond, but it also left room for something new, something honest. Now it was up to Peter to prove that his feelings were real, and it was up to Ella to decide whether she could ever trust him again. The days turned into weeks, and the distance between Peter and Ella remained, though it wasn't as sharp as before. Both were caught in their own struggles, reflecting on everything that had led them to this point. For Peter, it was a reckoning. He'd built his life on charm, ambition, and confidence, tools that had served him well in business and society. But, for the first time, none of those things mattered. Ella wasn't impressed by his wealth or status, and no clever quip or extravagant gesture could undo the damage he'd caused. He realized that if he wanted Ella to believe in him, he couldn't just say the right words. He had to show her. Ella, meanwhile, found herself in unfamiliar territory. She had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to guard her heart against those who might hurt her. But Peter had slipped past those defenses, and the betrayal had cut deeper than she thought possible. What scared her more was the realization that she missed him. Despite everything, she missed his laughter, his kindness, and even the way he challenged her. She spent her days in quiet reflection, trying to make sense of her feelings. Was it possible to forgive him? Could she take the risk of trusting him again, knowing it might lead to more pain? One night, Peter made a decision. He called his assistant and cancelled a major business trip, one that had the potential to secure a lucrative deal. "Are you sure, sir?" his assistant asked, clearly surprised. "This deal could be huge." "I'm sure," Peter replied firmly. "Some things are more important." For the first time in his life, Peter Marshall was putting someone else ahead of his ambition. Peter also started taking steps to prove to Ella that he understood her values. He donated a significant sum to a struggling local art program, ensuring that young artists would have opportunities she hadn't had. When Ella heard about the donation, she was stunned. She hadn't expected Peter to make such a gesture, especially since he hadn't even told her about it himself. It wasn't a grand announcement or a flashy stunt. It was quiet, thoughtful, and exactly the kind of thing that mattered to her. As the 6-month timeline approached, the weight of the bet loomed large over both of them. Peter knew he had to do something more, something that showed Ella exactly how much she meant to him. He called her one evening, his voice tentative. "Ella, I know you need time, but can you meet me tomorrow? There's something I want to show you." Ella hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face him again, to confront the feelings she'd been trying so hard to bury. But curiosity and a flicker of hope got the better of her. "All right," she said softly. The next day, Peter brought her to a small gallery in the heart of the city. "What is this?" Ella asked as they stepped inside. "You'll see," Peter said, leading her down a quiet hallway. When they reached the main exhibit, Ella's breath caught in her throat. The walls were lined with her artwork, pieces she'd created years ago and thought she'd lost forever. "I tracked them down," Peter explained. "Your family sold them to a collector. It took some time, but I managed to get them back." Ella turned to him, tears in her eyes. "Peter, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I just wanted you to know that I see you, Ella. Not the person you pretend to be, not the walls you put up to keep people out. I see you, and I'm not going anywhere." Ella looked at him, her heart pounding. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability he rarely let anyone see. "You've changed," she whispered. "I had to," Peter admitted, "because I couldn't stand the thought of losing you. Ella, you've made me want to be better, and for the first time in my life I feel like I'm not just living for myself. I'm living for you, too." Ella stepped closer, her voice trembling. "But what if I can't trust you again? What if this doesn't work?" "Then I'll keep trying," Peter said simply. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving it to you if I have to." Ella stared at him for a long moment, her walls crumbling one by one. She had spent so long guarding her heart, so long convincing herself that vulnerability was weakness, but maybe, just maybe, it was time to take a leap of faith. That night, as they stood in the gallery surrounded by her art, Ella made a decision. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you completely," she said honestly. "That's okay," Peter replied. "I'll wait. But I do know one thing," she continued. "You've given me a reason to try." Peter smiled, his relief and gratitude evident. "That's all I could ever ask for." As they left the gallery together, hand in hand, the 6-month timeline no longer felt like a countdown to the end. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something real, something neither of them had expected, but both of them were finally ready to embrace. The 6-month deadline had arrived, and the air in Peter's penthouse was thick with unspoken emotions. He sat across from Ella, his usually confident demeanor subdued. She, in turn, looked calm on the surface, but inside, her emotions churned like a storm. Peter broke the silence first, his voice soft yet steady. "Ella, I know I hurt you, and I know I might not deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that every moment we've spent together, every laugh, every argument, every moment of silence, has meant more to me than anything else in my life." Ella's chest tightened. She had never seen Peter so open, so raw. "I made that stupid bet because I didn't know what love was," he continued. "But being with you, I've learned. It's not about winning or losing, it's about you. The way you see the world, the way you fight for what you believe in, the way you've changed me without even trying." He leaned forward, his gaze locking with hers. "I love you, Ella, and I'll keep loving you, no matter what you decide tonight." Ella's throat tightened as tears welled in her eyes. For months, she had tried to shield herself from Peter, tried to keep him at arm's length. But somewhere along the way, he had broken through her defenses, not with grand gestures, but with quiet moments that revealed the man he truly was. "Do you remember what I said when we started this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Peter nodded. "That I didn't stand a chance." Ella sonrió débilmente, limpiando una lágrima de su mejilla. I was wrong. You didn't just stand a chance, Peter. You've proven to me that people can change, that love can grow in the most unexpected places. Peter's breath hitched. Does that mean... Ella stood, crossing the small distance between them. She reached for his hand, her touch gentle yet resolute. It means I'm scared, she admitted, but I'm willing to take that risk with you. Relief and joy flooded Peter's face as he stood and pulled her into his arms. You have no idea how much that means to me, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Ella rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. I'm not saying it'll be easy, she warned. We're both stubborn, and we have a lot to work through. Peter chuckled, pressing a kiss to her hair. Stubborn I can handle, as long as it's with you. The days that followed were filled with laughter, compromise, and a newfound sense of partnership. Peter no longer saw their marriage as a competition or a game. It was a journey they were embarking on together. And Ella, for the first time in years, allowed herself to trust and be vulnerable, knowing Peter had proven he was worth the risk. One evening, as they sat on the penthouse balcony watching the city lights, Peter turned to Ella with a smile. Do you know what the best decision I ever made was? He asked. Ella raised an eyebrow, teasing. Making that ridiculous bet? Peter laughed, shaking his head. Meeting you, loving you, and knowing that somehow I convinced you to love me back. Ella sonrió, inclinándose hacia él. It wasn't just you, Peter. You didn't convince me, you showed me. And for that, I'll always be grateful. As the months stretched into years, their love only deepened, strengthened by the challenges they had overcome and the lessons they had learned. What had started as a bet had transformed into something real and lasting, a testament to the power of change, forgiveness, and the unexpected magic of love. And though life continued to throw its challenges their way, Peter and Ella faced them together, hand in hand, knowing that the risks they had taken had been worth every moment. From rivalry to redemption, Peter and Ella's journey proves love can emerge in the most unlikely circumstances. Together, they shatter walls of arrogance and fear, discovering that real connection is worth every risk. What started as a bet became a bond, forever changing their lives and redefining the meaning of trust.